Greetings, I'm Zachary Hepner, and pleased to share this Dvar Torah with you for Parashat Ki Tisa. Tell me, who frequented the royal residence, killed a husband, and in a jiffy married the deceased's wife? The answer, of course, is Claudius, who murdered his brother, King Old Hamlet, and within 2 months married Gertrude post haste. As we know, that story is in no way a comedy. Now let's ask another question. What was King David's most egregious sin? What transgression was his, I quote, a very egregious sin, end quote? Was it the murder of Uriah Ha'hitti? Was it the post-haste marriage to Bathsheba? Was it the questionable circumstances that led to Bathsheba's pregnancy? Parenthetically, at a later time, you should take a close reading of Shabbat 56a on that. What's the terrible sin? Well, the text says it explicitly. It was an execution, but not of a person. It was David's execution of his census in Shmuel Bet, chapter 24. David was well familiar with the prohibition against making a census. It's an explicit prohibition in Parashat Ki Tisa, Exodus 30. And furthermore, Yoav, the Secretary of Defense, tells David in chapter 24, Vayomer Yoav el HaMelech, V'Adoni HaMelech lama chafetz b'davar hazeh. Yoav answered the king, but why should my lord the king want this? Yoav knew about the Exodus 30 prohibition. David knew about it too. And in chapter 24, verse 10, David has regret. And David said to the Lord, I have sinned grievously in what I have done. Then there's a collective punishment in the form of the plague, and the book ends with the plague ending at the stables of Arnon, the Jebusite, exactly where the future temple will be erected in Sefer Malachim. There couldn't be a greater ending and a cliffhanger. So with that prelude, let me ask the real question. Vayosef af Hashem lacharot beYisrael. The anger of the Lord flared up against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, Go and number Israel and Judah. Make a census. On the words, Vayosef af Hashem lacharot beYisrael, that the Lord flared up, his anger flared up against Israel, Rashi writes, Lo yadati alma. I do not know to what this is referring to. What is bothering Rashi? Could Rashi be reading the text in chronological order? The census had yet happened, so why did God's anger flare up? Certainly not because of the census. David's suspicious activity with Bathsheba was in the past, and David had already suffered greatly with the death of Avshalom, not to mention civil war, and of course, fratricide. I would like to attempt to solve Rashi's unsolved mystery on what actually incited God's anger. Starting with the Gemara in Yoma 22, Amar Rav Huna, Kama lo chali v'lo amar gishgavra demari sayishal ba'achas v'altalo, David b'shtayim v'lo altalo. V'ha'ika nami ma'aseh de Bathsheba, hatam iparu minei. Saul failed to perform the commandment to obliterate Amalek, and this single transgression had cost him the throne. Furthermore, even had Saul not killed the city of Ir HaKohanim, he would have been dethroned nonetheless. The Gemara, or Rav Huna, very cleverly focuses on 2 of David's transgressions, and not 3. David transgressed and went unpunished twice. According to Rav Huna, with the murder of his general Uriah and the census, those 2 sins, because he had the support of God, or he was on God's good side, or to be more precise, God chose to support him nonetheless. David was not dethroned, in contrast to Shaul. The Talmud then asks, what about the transgression with Bathsheba? And it answers that David had already been punished for that transgression. The Gemara makes a clear distinction. The narrative with Bathsheba and Uriah are 2 distinct sins, and not to be bunched together. Absolution from one of these sins does not mean that you're absolved from the other. The reckoning for Uriah was still pending, and that text makes such a reckoning clear. The verse in question is chapter 24, verse 1. The previous verse, right before that, in the end of chapter 23, lists the 37 war heroes enumerated. Who is the final hero? What is the last pasuk? Uriah Ha'hitti. Right after the words Uriah the Ha'hitti, 37 in all, the text then says, the anger of the Lord flared up, as if just to mention the name of Uriah Ha'hitti created an audit of the spiritual ledger of David and of Israel. David chose to make the census. He goes to Yoav. Vayomer HaMelech al Yoav sar ha'chayil. In all of Sefer Shmuel, Yoav is the secretary of war, sar tzava, the secretary of the legions, the army that is ready to act upon command. Not so in this final time that Yoav is described. He's called not sar tzava, but sar ha'chayil. Recorded in the Harry Truman Library on 1947, the functions of the Secretary of War were transferred to the Secretary of the Army and the Secretary of the Air Force, creating the Secretary of Defense as the new part of the national military establishment. For logistics and appearance purposes, the Secretary of War was retired, and it became, as we know today, the Secretary of Defense. The same thing is in Sefer Shmuel. All of Yoav's career, he was engaged in battle, and he had an active Secretary of War. Yoav was the 5-star general and Secretary of War, Sar Tzava. But in time of peace, his position was retired. Yoav became Secretary of Defense, Sar HaChayil. And now, during a time of stability, you, King David, choose to make the census? King David, your entire life, you have dealt with the most difficult straits. You have never had a census measuring your strength, and now in a time of peace and economic growth, you want that census? Don't all blessings emanate from God, as Yoav says explicitly in verse 2 and 3? Rabbi Yitzchak Etzshalom has observed that until the episode in Shmuel Bet, Chapter 11, David was personally involved in all his stately affairs. Personally, there. He was on the battlefield and personally engaged in the risky endeavors himself. The shift and alleged sins with the Bathsheba affair, no pun intended, only took place when Yoav was leading the battlefield and David was back in the royal palace. The two sins in chapter 11 take place when David was in a personal period of recreation, and the great sin of the census took place when Yoav was Sar HaChayil, not Sar Tzava. He was Secretary of Defense, not Secretary of War. A relatively peaceful time. The construction period. The American Reconstruction period is divided into the wartime Reconstruction, the presidential Reconstruction, and the congressional Reconstruction, which ended in 1877. I'm not sure what period of Reconstruction is represented in the last chapter of Sefer Shmuel, but with respect to Yoav, he was not actively on the battlefield, and he had enough resources to make the census. David's killing Uriah Ha'hitti was not only an act of murder, but David had played God by making the murder look like it was an accidental act of God. David engaging in the census is treasonous towards God, because all blessings come from God and not because of the census. Yoav giving David pushback is no frivolous side note. Who was the henchman who had actually killed Yoav? Who had actually killed Uriah? Well, the answer is Yoav. Did he give David pushback in chapter 24? In chapter 11? No, he was a co-conspirator. In chapter 11, he had Uriah killed. In chapter 24, Yoav gives pushback, but ultimately, Yoav is the one who performs the census. Am Yisrael is Rabim Beyad Me'atim. Armies don't win wars. God wins wars. Taxes don't support the treasury. God provides, and God continues to provide. Of all people in Tanakh who were in narrow straits and emerged on top, David could or should have known better and not performed the census. Back to solve the answer that Rashi had asked, Lo yadati alma. What was God angry about? Look one verse backwards. Uriah Ha'hitti. The killing of Uriah was surreptitiously executed, but the census will be public in open. The killing of Yoav is done when one does not want to take control of the fates. Having a census is only performed for future planning and focusing on the future, which only God is actually in control of. These sins seem distinctly different, but the juxtaposition of Uriah's name as the last verse of chapter 23 is the pink elephant in the room that cannot be ignored. Both the texts and Chazal want you to read them together. Rav Huna says that God supported David and his monarchy survived only because of God's grace, in contrast to Shaul, who did not have God's support and did not survive God's scrutiny. The book of Shmuel ends. David ends up on top yet again. David Melech Yisrael, Chai v'Kayam. Wishing you all a Shabbat Shalom.